Welcome to Dowdell Research. Discussion on ending slavery. Do we give credit to John Brown or Abraham Lincoln? There's always talk about Abraham Lincoln ending slavery. However, credit should really be given to John Brown. John Brown would perform raids on plantations and kill the owners of those plantations. And at one point, he had decided to raid the Federal Armory in Virginia to arm those who were enslaved. Now that's a scary thought. And I'll tell you why that's a scary thought later. John Brown was caught. The raid was a failure. He was hung immediately. And this was in 1859. Fast forward to Lincoln being elected in 1861. And the South was upset that Lincoln became the president. So upset was the South with Lincoln that they decided that they no longer wanted to be a part of the Union, and 7 of the states decided to break away to create their own nations. And the reason for this was that any new territory that settlers would settle in could no longer take slaves. And the reason for this was because in the Northwest Territory, they wanted it to be white. The whites of the South did not like this. They wanted to be able to take their enslaved laborers wherever they wanted to acquire land. And that meant if they wanted to go north, they wanted to take their enslaved laborers. And Lincoln was basically saying no. Lincoln at that point had declared war in 1861 against these states who decided to secede from the Union. This battle went on for 3 years before Abraham Lincoln would finally decide to allow the enslaved laborers to join the military. And the reason why he did this is because there was a map that showed why the South was still able to outmaneuver the Northern Union military. Now, this map that was shown to President Abraham Lincoln showed him what John Brown already knew about the South. That the South in specific areas was heavily populated with enslaved individuals that were of African and African American descent, that they sometimes outnumbered the plantation owner community. With this information, Abraham Lincoln decided to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. This was a stern warning to the South of those states that had seceded from the Union, that if they did not rejoin the Union, that their enslaved laborers would be freed and the land would be taken. This threat of the freeing of the enslaved did not scare the plantation owners. They continued to fight, and the reluctant President Lincoln had to issue the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 and began to allow the enslaved African Americans, to join the military to fight their former owners. Now, this strategy worked because the African Americans lived in the South. Lincoln didn't live there. He was born in Kentucky, but his family moved to Indiana. So they could encourage other African Americans to join. As a matter of fact, former enslaved Frederick Douglass encouraged the enslaved of the South to desert the plantations and get to the North as quick as they could to join the Union Army to defeat slavery, for them to fight for their freedom. Now it was on and popping. John Brown knew that the reason the African Americans were still enslaved was because they did not have access to weapons. Here was the opportunity for them to get weapons and to seize their freedom. And they went in droves to the North, and they were defeated by the end of the war. The South was defeated, and the African Americans gained their freedom in 1865. Supposedly. It was only a few months later that the president, Abraham Lincoln, was assassinated, and Andrew Johnson took his place. Once President Lincoln was assassinated, Andrew Johnson became the President of the United States of the Union. And Johnson, what he did immediately was he began to pardon these individuals who were actually traitors that had left the Union. And he gave them their land back. And he also told them that they would be the ones, their states would be the ones to say what they would do with their enslaved laborers. They would make the determination, not the federal government. And this turned back the hands of time for African Americans who were emancipated. They began to put in the Reconstruction laws, the black codes, to say where blacks could go, what blacks could do, whether they could vote, whether they could get educated, whether they could do anything, spit on the sidewalk. Johnson was from Tennessee. In 1866, in Pulaski, Tennessee, his hometown, the KKK, was founded. The KKK were Confederates who believed in white supremacy, that they should be the only ones who have rights. And they came down hard on any of the whites who supported the new black freedom, and they came down hard on any African American who thought that they could do or go wherever they wanted to. My surname, Dowdell, is an Irish name, and they fled to, some of the family members fled to Tennessee. And they were coming out of Alabama and Georgia. And what happened in Alabama is that these southern plantation owners, they band together. They took the community of certain areas like Russell, Chambers County, Tallapoosa, I'm not saying that right, and another one, and they banded together. They took all the African Americans that they could gather that were formerly enslaved and locked them into one location. This way that they could control them and keep them in the area and still use them as laborers, not enslaved, but use a different term as servants or rail workers. But anyway, 1866 was a shift back into a certain type of restriction on the movements of African Americans after slavery. So what we do know is that the United States of the Confederates, led by Jefferson Davis, was allowed back into the Union of the United States of America. So now you had the Confederate who believed in white supremacy were given state rights to do what they wanted to do, and that was to give all privileges to white citizens. This is my closing. You make the decision of which man did more for ending slavery, John Brown or Abraham Lincoln. But what we do know is that the Civil War was based upon slavery. Thank you for listening.